to the Mindset Michelle TV show. We're so super excited to have you join us and to hear some more amazing and incredible experts from all over the world, from all over this wonderful planet, sharing their insights and suggestions about how you can create a successful mindset. And today we have an extra special guest all the way from Daytona Beach, Florida. Please welcome Oak. Hello, Oak.
Well, thanks, Michelle. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
It's so great to have you. And for those of you, and there may be many here in Australia that perhaps have not heard of Oak, his full name and his full honorific is Retired Lieutenant Colonel Oakland McCulloch. And as you can hear, he's a retired serviceman. So please, I'd like to start by saying thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that.
Since finishing in the services and finishing, serving his country, which is a very important profession, Oak, and thankfully I don't need to keep saying the full honorific, but Oak.
That's right.
Oak has had a really incredible and successful career in the leadership space and becoming a global speaker, becoming somebody that's very passionate about servant leadership. So I'm thinking service from all of his years of service in
That's right.
Forces, of course. But service very neatly, I guess, translates into servant leadership, which is very similar. And his book, Your Leadership Legacy, Becoming the Leadership Leader You Want to Be, is also something that has created his legacy, just like his services legacy. That is something that has had a profound impact around the globe. But I think I've said more than enough about Oak. And Oak, please explain to people, how did you become somebody so successful in the services and then successful globally as a leader?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Michelle, and that was a nice introduction. So I, growing up, I was an athlete. I was the leader of my sports teams, American football, baseball, basketball. I was leader of my student government. I was class president. So I've been a leader in some way or another for over 40 years. And then about sophomore year in high school, I decided I wanted to be an officer in the United States Army. And so I started applying to ROTC, the ways to become an officer in America, and West Point. And I got accepted to West Point. And I did my first 2 years at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Got some leadership experience there. And then finished up in ROTC, where I met my wife, by the way, who was also an Army nurse. So she did 8 years in the Army as a nurse. And so I've been doing this leadership thing for a while, 23 years of it in the Army as an Army officer, infantry and armored cavalry, combat arms officer. And then when I retired, I did the day-to-day operation of a food bank, which as the associate director, I ran the food bank day-to-day. So I was responsible for all the day-to-day stuff that was going on in the hiring and firing of the food bank personnel. So, and then decided to come and do Army ROTC as a recruiter. And I'm still, I'm at Department of the Army civilian now and still doing leadership stuff. And that's kind of where I got, and now I've moved on I published my book and I'm going on the speaking engagements, because at this point in my life, that really is my passion, to talk to as many young men and women as I can.
Wow. And I love how your clarity around that leadership theme that you recognize you had from early on. I can hear the passion behind it, and with the stage that you're at, that passion around sharing that skill and experience with others. I'm fascinated then, it sounds like you had that certainty in a way and that clarity and obviously going down that military leadership path from early on. With that success in so many different areas of your life, what do you think now that success means to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's about three things that I think means success. Number one is getting results, mission accomplishment. So whatever your job is because in the real world, results do matter. in the fantasy land where everybody's a winner and everybody gets a trophy, maybe not. But in the real world, the business world, the military, all that, results do matter. And so I think mission accomplishment, you got to be able to do the things that you're being asked to do, to accomplish, to get a result. And, growing up, my father told me he had this rule growing up, and he called it the 75% rule. And he always told me, he said, son, if you can't do something better than 75% of the people doing it, then you need to do one of two things. You either need to figure out how to get better at it, or you need to go do something else, because obviously it doesn't matter to you. So I think that's the number one thing for me is mission accomplishment. Number two, I think, is not just focused on me, but on the organization. So I think a leader, in my opinion, to be successful, and my definition of success is to create an organization with a culture that empowers people to be the best they can be. And the way you do that, in my opinion, is that you get away from micromanaging and making it about you, and you make it about the people in your organization, and you empower them to make decisions at the lowest level. And then the third thing is making people in the organization better, because leadership is about people, and plain and simple, no other way about it. So if you can make the people in your organization better, then I think then you have succeeded.
Oak. Sorry, Oak, I'm just going to pause for a moment because the internet, the internet's pretty bad here in Australia. So hang on a second.
Okay.
Good. Fabulous. 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to the Mindset Michelle TV show. It's so super exciting to have you joining us today. And I have an extra special guest today joining me all the way from Daytona Beach in Florida. Hello, Oak. How are you going?
I'm doing well. How are you, Michelle?
I'm great, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today. So for those of you that aren't aware of who Oak is, his full title is Retired Lieutenant Colonel Oakland McCulloch. So as many of you are hearing in that wonderful title, he's ex-services, and ex, I don't want to say with any disrespect, because I'd like to start with saying thank you for your service, Oak.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that.
And I think anybody that's watching that has people in services or has been in the services, again, a great big thank you to you as well. But since leaving the forces and leaving a distinguished career, Oak has also set up a very distinguished career in the leadership space as a global speaker, as somebody that's a trusted advisor, and also as an accomplished author of a book on your leadership legacy, becoming the leader that you want to be. That's enough from me about Oak. Oak, do you want to share with people a little bit more about your background and how you came to be in the services, and then after the services, how you came to be so passionate in the leadership space?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I've got over 40 years of leadership experience in one way or another. And I guess it was, I was an athlete in high school. I played baseball, basketball, and American football. And I was always the captain of my team. And I was student government president, my class president. So I've always been in leadership roles, and I enjoyed being in leadership roles. And I guess it was about my sophomore year in high school that I decided that I really wanted to pursue the military piece of it and be an officer in the United States Army. And so I would start going through that process, and I applied to West Point, United States Military Academy. And through ROTC, I applied to those scholarships. And I got both. And I did my first 2 years at West Point at the United States Military Academy. And then I came and I finished up in ROTC, which, by the way, is where I met my wife, who is also a service member. She spent 8 years as an Army nurse in the Army. And so did 23 years as an infantry officer and combat arms officer, a armored cavalry officer, 23 years on active duty. And then when I retired, I ran a food bank I was the day-to-day operations of a food bank for about 18 months, where I was responsible for the pickup delivery of food, doing food handouts, food drives, those kinds of things, and the hiring and firing and counseling of the people who work there. Then I came, and I'm now in the Department of the Army Civilian, where I work for Army ROTC. So I kind of gone full circle, and then that's where I out on my speaking engagements and wrote my book, Your Leadership Legacy: Becoming the Leader You Were Meant to Be.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing so succinctly and so clearly that arch. And I love that arch of, starting at the ROTC and finishing your career, or the end part of your career being associated with the ROTC as well. And
and again, at this point in my life, it really is about leadership to me. That's my passion, is to get out and talk to as many young men and women as I can.
And that's wonderful, that whole focus on service and focus on the next generation, with looking for people like yourself that at that age were looking for leaders to show them how they could set up their career and their pathways as a leadership in leadership. And I also love that story of meeting your wife there, and it's always very lovely to hear about the other types of allegiances that get made whilst working in services. And I think it's interesting, there must have been a lot of similarities between the logistics around being in the forces and the logistics of running a food bank. But before we get too far into things like that, I love with that background and that flow, knowing from an early age about wanting to be in that leadership space, and then knowing at this stage towards the end of your career about similarly that you want to be in that leadership space. So this common theme throughout all the different times. What would you say then that success means to you? With success in so many different fields and areas and so much expertise in the leadership space, what would you say success is then?
Yeah, so I always tell people that, for me, success means getting the job done, being successful at what you're doing. In my book, I talk about all the things you got to do to be a good leader. And in my presentation, I do that as well. And I always end it with, at least in my opinion, for me, it doesn't matter. I could have done all the things in the book, but if I didn't get the results at the end, doesn't matter, because in the real world, results do matter. Now, having said that, does that mean that I've never failed, that I've never not accomplished my mission? No, nobody's perfect in this world. I keep trying to convince my wife that I am, but she's not buying it. Nobody's perfect. We're all going to make mistakes, and that's okay. I had a boss one time who said, Oak, if you didn't make a mistake today, you probably didn't do anything. We're all going to make mistakes, and that's okay. You just got to learn from them and then be more successful the next time. So that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But my father, as I was growing up, my father had this thing called the 75% rule. And he used to tell me, Oak, if you can't do something better than 75% of the people doing it, then you need to figure out one of two things. You either need to figure out how to get better at what you're doing, or you need to go do something else, because obviously it doesn't matter to you. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that when you start doing something that you got to be better than 75% of the people, because we all know that's probably not the case for most people. And it certainly wasn't for me. But I think why he told me that, and what has stuck with me to help me be successful, is that you have to continue to work to get better at whatever it is you're doing. And eventually your goal should be to be better than 75% of the people doing it. Does that mean you can't be successful if you're not there? No, but that's my vision of success, just from the upbringing that I had from my father.
And I love that as well. That again shows the values that you carried through into your years in the Army and now your years in the leadership space. And I love that 75% rule, that focus on the outcomes. And then that's a really good way of measuring, it is true that sometimes you can really work and study and work and work and work, but it still might not be a good area for you or your area of expertise, or you can work and work only a little bit and become, 80% in terms of the rest of the market.
That's right.
everything.
That's right.
It's
And it's funny because I always tell people, you need to try to be the best you can be at whatever it is you do. And that's certainly what I do. I try to be the best at whatever I do, based on all that. But really, because you are going to be judged by your performance based on what other people who are doing the same job as you are doing. For me, and I get people all the time who say, well, Colonel McCulloch, I don't judge myself against other people. I only judge myself against myself. And I say, well, that's great. You should do that. But if you don't believe that other people are judging you based on what you do with somebody, that somebody else is doing the same job as you are, then you're sadly mistaken, because we are. Because that's how we decide who's going to get promotions, who's going to get pay raises, who's going to get all those things. And life isn't all about those things, but it is, if you want to be good at what you do, you need to be very good at what you do.
I love what you're saying, and that being good at what you do. A friend of mine shared with me the other day about this idea that she'd come across to do with, if you're not in those decision-making rooms, who's in the room talking for you or representing you? And I think that exactly what you're saying, as much as we don't like to think that people judge, they do judge, they do allocate, who's better than somebody else. And so doing that self-reflection around, am I more than 75% than everybody else in this? And I like that second part about doing something else, because for me, it's very important to keep having the what else, what if.
Right.
This all leads very nicely, though, because I'm so fascinated with your specialist skill set and your background. You must have very different ways of looking at leadership and of course, from the American culture as well, leadership. So what sorts of suggestions would you have for viewers about how they can create this mindset for success and also integrate things like this wonderful 75% idea and concept into what they do? So what sort of suggestions have you?
Yeah, so some of the things that I use and that I think have always been successful for me in allowing me to be successful, because you got to have some tools. You can't just wake up and expect things just to fall in your lap. You got to prepare yourself, and you got to have some tools. And I always tell people the number one thing that I think to help you be successful, I don't know of anybody in my life who I would consider successful who does not have some self-discipline. And I think that there's a huge difference between discipline and self-discipline. Discipline, I'm standing over top of you and I'm telling you what to do, when to do it, how to do it. We can discipline anybody, and that doesn't help you as a person to help you be successful, in my opinion. What helps is self-discipline, where you're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because somebody's standing over you and talking to you and telling you to do it. So self-discipline is huge, in my opinion. And here's the reason it's so important. We all like to think we're motivated every day, but in real life, we're not. There are days when you are not motivated. And if you're honest, you're going to admit to that. If you are self-disciplined, those days when you're not motivated, where the motivation makes you do the right thing and do the things that you need to do, on those days when you're not motivated, your self-discipline will make you do those. And that's why self-discipline is so important. I think the second thing that I would tell people
just before we move on, then maybe to the second thing, I really, and sorry, of course, to interrupt there, but I love this idea about self-discipline. It's something that I've looked at myself over many, many years, because, and I like how you distinguish between outward discipline and somebody saying to you, you must do this, or telling you must do this, and yourself kind of building those habits and those patterns of that discipline or self-discipline to do it. I know with things like in Australia, when we had people start to move to working from home, it became much more about that self-discipline. You weren't in an office environment where everybody else was sitting at the desk at 9 o'clock and doing this at this time and that at that time. So people became more responsible for their time and their activities. And so it was starting to build more of that self-discipline and that habit forming in positive ways of, well, okay, I might not feel like being at the desk at 9 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock, whatever time you start, but I'm going to be there and I'm going to be presentable as if I'm going to work, even if I have no video meetings in that day, because it's building that discipline for yourself and not for others.
I absolutely agree. And I think habits are another one of the 3 things or 4 things that I would say that you have to be successful. And look, we're all creatures of habit. The question is, are they good habits or are they bad habits? And you got to get to the point where you have developed good habits for yourself so that you're doing the right things on a daily basis. And, and when I tell people, sometimes I tell people that we're all creatures of habit, and somebody tells me, no, I'm not. And I said, really? I said, remember how you put your shoes on this morning. I promise you tomorrow you will put your shoes on exactly the same way. We are creatures of habit, and that's good. It's good to have habits so you don't have to think about what it is that you're doing. It just becomes natural. But again, you got to get to the point where you are creating good habits for yourself, because there is a difference between good habits and bad habits.
And that's so true. I know that people, especially when you think about food or alcohol or some of those alcohol and things are probably a bit more obvious in terms of it can become a bad habit. But good habits around food, about sleep, around water, all of those things that keep the physical side of your body operating to optimum. People don't necessarily see that as a habit of, well, I've eaten chicken every day this week, so I now need to bring in a different type of protein or something like that. It's that awareness that some of the habits that you're maybe not even thinking about, you may need to change. With your book, that's what I was thinking about before when you talked about self-discipline. I know that when I wrote my book, it actually took an incredible amount of discipline to sit at the desk and write every day and write and write and write. What was that experience like for you? Because it was discipline as well as the habit of sitting down and going, I'm going to do it now, when there were many other things I could have been doing.
So I always tell people, it's funny because I do have a day job. I do the recruiting for Army ROTC. So I do have to go into the office and do things. So when I did have days off, I would think to myself, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write all day today. And I'd sit down and I'd start writing. And I was like, it is not coming. It's not going to happen. So, what I found was that I really just had, when the feeling came to me, that's when I had to write. And I don't care if it was 2-3 o'clock in the morning. One of the things I always tell people is when I started writing the book, I wrote out my table of contents. And so I'd be laying in bed at night and I'd wake up and something would come to me. And I think, well, I'll write about that tomorrow. And guess what? Tomorrow morning when I woke up, it was gone. So one of the things that I did to help me was, and to help with the discipline piece of it was, I put a folder in my computer for each one of the chapters. And in each chapter, I put a blank Word document so that when I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I had some idea, I could run into my office, just type a sentence or two, just to jog my memory about what it was I was thinking about. And then the next morning when I got up, or the next time I was motivated, it was there and it brought my attention back to what it was I was thinking about. But, it takes some discipline, and it takes some, the habits of doing the right things whenever it's the right things to do. But discipline is one of those things that self-discipline is so key. It is just, to me, that is the number one thing that you got to have if you want to be successful.
I think it's interesting, there's things here in Australia called the 5 a.m. club, where people have that discipline to get up so that they're starting the day at 5 a.m., etc.
I set my alarm clock every morning for 5 o'clock.
Wow. Yeah. And that again can be part of that, setting up the disciplines that work for you. I like your way and your explanation about writing your book. I had something similar where if I got ideas and I, like you, I initially would be lying there and I get an idea and then forget it in the morning and go,
Oh, it's
oh my
gone.
God, you know, it was just gone.
And it was a great idea. It was probably, you know, you wish you had had it. Put it in your
It was
book.
that $1 million idea, you know, I was going to be able to retire to Florida, or, you know, all that kind of stuff. What I did in the end was I actually used notes on my phone, or I dictated into my phone. You know, I just make sure that I captured the idea, and I still, because at the time I had bits of paper everywhere, and I still remember you moving to the phone and actually feeling much better that I could go back to those concepts that I'd been inspired by while my brain was processing through everything.
Yeah, well, and I don't think it matters what technique you use, but you got to have a technique that then jogs your memory. And I don't think it's just for writing a book. I think that's for everything. I'd use it during the day, you know, during the day when I'll think of something and I've got a little, you know, Post-it notes, and I jot down notes for myself because, you know, I'm going to be 60 years old here in January. So I'm an old man. I forget things if I don't write them down. So, you know, I write something down so that it jogs my memory when I get home, or when, you know, when I'm moving on to the next thing. So I think whatever technique you use, and I like the phone piece and giving yourself a message. I haven't used that yet, but that's something I may start to use instead of the 3x5, because I always have my phone with me. So, I mean, no matter what, I'll have that. So that's a good technique. I'm glad you brought that up. I'll incorporate that into my my discipline part of it.
Oh, great. Well, where it started was with the book itself. I was doing interviews and recording them on the phone. And so that's when I realized, I could actually dictate. Because again, this is interesting because it's a habit, because like yourself, I'd always just use pen and paper because I'm very visual. And so me letting go of that was actually not difficult, but it was a shift to be able to trust auditory remembering by hearing myself say, oh, this is the idea I had on the phone. The other,
well, it goes back to habits. Your habit was to write it down, and now you got to break that habit and start another one.
Exactly. It was an interesting habit to shift. The other thing that I think is interesting that we're talking about here is something called the reticular activating system. And the easiest way I explain it to people is to talk about, you know, if you want to buy a red car, your brain is structured in a way that you will then start to see red cars everywhere, because your reticular activating system is triggered, turned on in a way. And so writing a book, I'm similar for you, Oak. When I was writing my book, I suddenly started to see all sorts of information and translate whatever I was seeing into how did it relate back to my book.
Right.
And so with leadership and building that mindset for success, what I'm suggesting to people is that it's a similar kind of process. If you're thinking about, well, I'm 75% or I'm at 70% in this area, and in this skill, you know, I need to get better at presenting through it via Zoom, or I need to develop my skills doing this or doing that, then that's a great way to kind of put the reticular activating system to work and go, well, it's not a red car, but it's, you know, what courses or things are out there to help me get better presenting on Zoom. And then once you put your mind to it and put the notes on your phone, etc., around it, you're actually programming your brain to start looking for answers to it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I'd never heard that name for it before, but I've heard that concept before, and I absolutely believe it. And I think that when we're talking about leadership, then what if you're thinking about leadership and you're thinking about becoming a better leader and a better person, then you start recognizing good behavior and good things that other leaders are doing. And, you know, I always tell people, you know, you got to have like a card catalog. You know, I dated myself there. Card catalog, a little storage compartment in the back of your head that when you see something that you like, that you think is good, that you want to use, then it goes into your storage. Just as importantly, when you see something that is horrible, and we've all been there, you see somebody do something horrible, you got to think to yourself and store it. Yeah, I'm never going to do that. Because I think you can learn just as much from somebody who does something poorly as you can from somebody who does something well. And so, and I have in my life. obviously you want to, hopefully you're in a position where you're learning from good people, and that's where we all want to be. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
And I like that point that you've raised about, because sometimes it can also be quite relative. Something can seem really good until you see, you might see a 75% type of leader, and then you see a 90% leader and you go, oh, actually, that's what it's really.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
And then you start figuring out what the difference is. What made the difference between 75% and 90%. And you'll pick it out. If you really want to, you'll start following them and looking at them and watching them. And it might be something as simple as somebody listening to somebody a little bit better, or it might be, their self-discipline. I mean, you'll figure out what it is that makes them that little bit better if you really pay attention.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to honor the fact that you actually have thought about some more suggestions. So quickly, what would those other suggestions be about creating a successful mindset?
Yeah, I think the next one is goal setting and accomplishing goals. And to me, I've always been the person who, I never set my goal to the next level. I'm a firm believer that when you set a goal, you set it for a perfect world, understanding there is no perfect world. I got it. And we may never get there. But if you set it for the perfect world and you get close, that's better than what you would have done. And the quote that always comes back to me, Vince Lombardi, a famous American football coach here in America, he always used to say that you strive for perfection. Understanding perfection is unattainable, but if you strive for perfection, then you might get to excellence, and that's pretty good. And so that's always been my philosophy. If I set my goal in the perfect world, then I might get pretty close to that, and that's going to get me pretty good. So I think it's where you set your goal, and then I think you got to have sub goals in there so that you can celebrate some successes here and there, because that keeps you motivated, that keeps you on track. If you can make this goal and then tomorrow you start the next little subset of goals, and then eventually it's leading toward the big goal.
I really like that I talk about it in terms of micro steps, so taking that small next step on that pathway to the bigger goal, and that's a wonderful distinction about striving for striving for perfection and getting to excellence along the way. And
yeah.
I think that the definition again of perfection is again very subjective. So understanding what perfection means to you in terms
That's right.
of,
it's going to be different depending on your profession. Somebody's in my profession may be different than your profession. I mean, so it is a very individual thing, as it should be, because we're talking about your mindset of success. You got to figure out what that looks like in the profession and in the business and in the world that you live in. And then once you do that, then you can start figuring out how to be successful. But until you figure out what it looks like, you're going to have a hard time. I mean, then you're just kind of aimlessly going out there. You don't have any direction. You don't have any goals. You don't have any place to get to, and it's not a destination because you're never going to get there completely. I got it. It's a journey, but you got to at least have a path that you want to go on to figure out what that destination looks like if you could ever get there.
And I think you've raised a really, really important point, because with social media and even people watching this through social media, one of those points that we raised earlier about judging and 75% versus, other percentages, I think it's really important to pick what perfection is for you, and then stick to that path and stick to that goal, like we were talking about with the reticular activating system. Because with so much other information from social media and elsewhere now, you can keep being swayed of, oh, okay, I think I'm really good, but actually when I look at so-and-so, they're really good, but they may only do that one small part of what you do, or they may do it for a completely different reason. So sticking to what you believe perfection is actually really important, because it's your definition and it's your pathway. That's
right. And you're the one that's got to live it. I always tell people, look, you can't, you can't let other people live your life and make decisions for you. You got to do that. And I think that's all part of your self-discipline. It's part of goal setting. It's part of habits. All that kind of comes together. You got to figure out what it is that you want and what is perfection, or what is where you want to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, whatever it is. And then you got to figure out the pathway to get there, and you got to stick to it. And that's the self-discipline and habit part of it, is to stick to it. The goal part is where you want to be. And then, like you said, the small increment, the micro goals in between that allow you to keep moving, and celebrate those small goals successes, because that's so important. That's what keeps you motivated. That's what keeps you going. That's what lets you know that you're on the right path and you're doing the right things. So take time to celebrate those small ones. It really is important.
And what a wonderful way to lead into celebrating you being on the show today. And how can people connect perhaps with you? What's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. LinkedIn is probably the easiest way. And then I have a website. I have a website that is associated with my book and with my speaking engagements. And so you can always just type in my name, Oakland McCulloch, and my website will come up. As far as I know, there are only 3 Oakland McCullochs: me, my son, and my grandson. And I think you can pick out which one is which whenever it pops up.
So if you don't mind, it might be a bit of a cheeky question, but if your son is called Oak Jr.,
no, he's not
called Oak Jr.
No, so he is not Oak Jr. because I don't have a middle name, so I'm just Oakland McCulloch. He does have a middle name. His name is Oakland Vincent McCulloch, and then he named his son, get this one, Oakland Maverick McCulloch. That young man is never going to be able to hide. Okay? Yeah.
Wow, what powerful names, and
Yeah.
what an amazing legacy for you. And so the last question then for today is around what advice you might give to your younger self.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really, there's really 2 things that I think about. And there are advices that I give. It's the advice I give all of the young men and women who I talk to. Number 1 is, if I could go back and learn something at a younger age as a leader, it would be my listening skills. We are all horrible listeners, at least most of us are. And certainly in America, we are. Most of us are thinking, when somebody's talking to us, we're not trying to understand what they're saying and listening. We're trying to decide what we're going to answer with. And that is horrible. That is not a good way to be a listener. And I really learned that when I was a captain in the United States Army. So probably about the 10-year mark in my career, I had a boss who was a lieutenant colonel who really taught me the importance of being a good listener. And the way he did it was, as I was coming into work in the morning, usually 2 or 3 days a week, we'd pass each other. And he would say, "Oak, how you doing today?" And, the first couple of times I was like, "I'm doing fine." And I kept trying to walk past him, and he'd step in front of me and say, "No, I want to know how you're doing. Tell me how you're doing." And when I tell him, he'd say, "How's your wife doing? How's Kel doing? And didn't your son and daughter have a soccer game this weekend? How'd they do?" And, he was a very busy man. And not one time when he was doing all that did I ever see him look down at his watch and like he had somewhere better to be. At that moment, I was the most important thing going on in his life. And I started feeling like I was really special. But then one day I stuck my head out the door, and guess what? He's doing that to another captain too. But that, the power of that stuck in my mind, how good that made me feel, that somebody actually wanted to know and actually listen to what I had to say. So I would tell some people, be a better listener, work at it, go out every day and find somebody, one person in your organization, and talk to them. Find out something new about them, not about work, their personal life, their wife or husband's name, their kids' names, what hobbies they have, what their kids are up to, where they like to vacation. In it something, find out one new thing every single day from somebody in your organization.
Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful piece of advice to give your younger self, and to be giving younger people that you're supporting today. So it's been such an honor and a privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me, Michelle. This was a great experience. I loved it.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And to all the viewers out there, thank you again for watching. And we really do feel very privileged to be able to bring you this show. But for now, from my heart to your heart, be great, be fabulous, and be you.